Guys! Look at us. Squabbling. Bickering.
In the early 80s, British TV was still playing it safe. Neat living rooms, canned laughter, and jokes you could watch with your nan. Then the young ones crashed onto the screen. Suddenly you had punk rockers smashing through walls, talking animals wandering into scenes, and 4 students living in a house that looked like it might collapse any second. This comedy was loud, surreal, and just impossible to ignore. Today, we're looking at 20 wild reasons why this anarchic masterpiece still lives rent-free in our memories, decades later. When The Young Ones debuted in 1982, British TV was dominated by cosy family sitcoms and predictable laugh tracks. Then suddenly, viewers were confronted with an explosion of noise, chaos, and irreverence. It wasn't just funny, it was cultural rebellion in motion. The characters broke the fourth wall, the storylines defied logic, and the entire show seemed to exist in its own warped universe. For young audiences, it felt like television had finally caught up with their own sense of frustration and wild energy. For older audiences, it looked like utter madness. This was the moment alternative comedy announced itself with a bang, and it forever changed what British viewers expected from a sitcom. What made The Young Ones truly iconic was its cast. Rik Mayall, Adrian Edmondson, Nigel Planer, and Christopher Ryan didn't just play roles, but embodied archetypes that still resonate. Each actor came from the live comedy circuit, part of a movement determined to tear down safe, old-fashioned humour. Together, they were unstoppable. Their collective energy turned simple lines into unforgettable moments. Mayall's manic outbursts, Edmondson's gleeful violence, Planer's tragic muttering, and Ryan's cool detachment created a balance of chaos and calm that was unlike anything else on screen. Watching them interact was like seeing the perfect storm of comedy. They were more than just polished sitcom stars. They were anarchists with scripts, and audiences loved them for it. If there was one face that captured the spirit of The Young Ones, it was Rik Mayall. His character, Rik, was a walking parody of self-important students who claimed to be revolutionaries but secretly longed for attention. Rik's rants about politics, poetry, and injustice were over the top, insincere, and brilliantly hilarious. Mayall poured himself into the role with wild facial expressions, sudden outbursts, and boundless energy. He managed to make Rik simultaneously annoying and magnetic. Beyond the show, Mayall became one of the defining comedians of his generation, but it was here, as the fake radical living in a crumbling student house, that his anarchic genius first captured national attention. To this day, fans quote Rik's melodramatic lines with gleeful nostalgia. Do you remember one yourself? Adrian Edmondson's Vivian was chaos personified, sporting orange hair, metal studs, and a face perpetually locked in aggression. Vivian was the embodiment of punk rock energy. He didn't just dislike authority, he obliterated it with crowbars and dynamite. His violence was so over the top, it became comedy rather than menace. Walls collapsed, televisions exploded, and yet somehow, Vivian always survived, looking tougher than ever. Edmondson's timing made his character both terrifying and irresistibly funny. Unlike Rik's desperate need for approval, Vivian lived in the moment, ready to destroy anything that bored him. He was the tornado tearing through every scene, and audiences adored his unpredictability. If the show was about rebellion, then Vivian was its unstoppable battering ram. Nigel Planer's Neil gave the group its perfect opposite energy. Where Rik was loud and Vivian destructive, Neil was quiet, slow, and perpetually miserable. As the house's downtrodden hippie, Neil became the butt of endless jokes. His catchphrases about depression, suicide, and hopelessness should have been bleak, but Planer's delivery made them both tragic and hilarious. Audiences felt sorry for Neil while laughing at his melodramatic despair. His constant cooking disasters, attempts at gardening, and sighing monologues gave the show moments of absurd stillness in the middle of chaos. Neil represented the washed-up optimism of the 60s, colliding with the harshness of the 80s. He was a walking cultural critique wrapped in a pair of sandals. While chaos raged around him, Christopher Ryan's Mike stood apart. He wasn't screaming, smashing walls, or collapsing into despair. Instead, he played it cool. Mike was a con man, a schemer, and the self-proclaimed leader of the group. He always had a plan, whether it was scamming people or charming women. What made Mike fascinating was how he provided contrast. Amid all the noise, his calm confidence gave the audience someone to latch onto. Ryan's understated performance was essential, keeping the show from spinning completely off the rails. Without Mike, the group would have felt like three chaotic forces with no centre. With him, it became a dysfunctional but oddly balanced household. He was the eye in the storm. Traditional sitcoms in the 80s followed a formula. A family or group of friends, a setup, a punchline, and canned laughter. The young ones gleefully tore that formula apart. There was no laugh track, no cosy living room with tidy resolutions. Instead, episodes were unpredictable patchworks of chaos. A normal conversation might be interrupted by a puppet show, an animated sequence, or a sudden song. Storylines didn't wrap up neatly. They often imploded. This bold rejection of sitcom tradition made it feel alive and dangerous. Viewers never knew what would happen next, and that unpredictability was the very thing that kept them coming back for more. It was less a sitcom and more an experiment on television itself. One of the strangest and most brilliant elements of The Young Ones was the decision to feature live rock bands in the middle of episodes. Instead of a commercial break, viewers got Madness, Motorhead, or The Damned performing in the students' living room. These moments tied the show directly to the music scene of the 80s. Beyond comedy, it was punk culture brought to the screen. For young viewers, it felt authentic, like their own music and lifestyle were finally being celebrated on TV. For the BBC, it was risky but revolutionary. The bands didn't feel out of place either. In a house where walls exploded and sandwiches sang, live rock performances made perfect sense. One of the trademarks of The Young Ones was its gleeful use of violence. Vivian punched Rick, Rick smashed Neil, and household objects routinely exploded into pieces. Instead of being shocking, it was hilarious because of how over the top it was staged. Chairs collapsed, heads went through walls, and characters always bounced back unhurt, ready for the next disaster. This cartoonish violence made the show feel like a live-action comic book. It pushed the boundaries of slapstick and gave physical comedy a raw punk edge. It also mirrored the frustrations of youth in Thatcher-era Britain, where destruction became a punchline rather than a tragedy. Comedy turned chaos into laughter, and violence became an art form in itself. If a normal sitcom kept things grounded, this show went surreal in the best way possible. One moment the characters argued over dirty dishes, the next, a talking rat offered commentary. Objects came to life, furniture danced, and puppets appeared out of nowhere. This surreal humour was inspired by Monty Python but taken even further. Instead of clever sketches, the surrealism in The Young Ones felt messy, loud, and completely unrestrained. It kept the audience on edge because nothing in the house was safe from transformation. Viewers could never predict if a frying pan would start singing or if a piece of cheese would deliver a monologue. The result was a sitcom that felt like a surreal dream, constantly reinventing itself. Beneath the chaos and silliness, The Young Ones had sharp teeth. Much of its humour was political, mocking Thatcher-era Britain, unemployment, student protests, and class divides. Rik's fake radicalism was a jab at performative politics, while Neil's despair symbolised the defeated idealism of the 60s generation. Even the constant poverty of the students reflected real struggles of young people at the time. The show never preached directly, but it embedded satire into every exaggerated rant and collapsing ceiling. Viewers laughed, but they also recognised the truth underneath. That's what made it stand out. The fact that it wasn't just nonsense, but had meaning that resonated with many. The house in the show wasn't just a backdrop, it was practically a character. Walls crumbled, doors broke, and random objects appeared in the strangest places. Sometimes the house seemed to respond to the chaos inside, falling apart piece by piece as if alive. This gave the show a unique visual identity. Unlike the pristine sets of most sitcoms, the student's house was dirty, unstable, and unpredictable. Just like the characters themselves, it perfectly represented the decaying environment of 80s Britain, while also serving as a playground for slapstick gags and surreal surprises. By making the house feel alive, the show gave its chaos a physical, tangible presence that viewers would never forget. Trying to explain the plot of an episode was almost impossible. One episode began with the students preparing for exams and ended with a nuclear apocalypse. Another centered on a game show that appeared out of nowhere. Storylines were less about logic and more about escalation. The writers constantly pushed situations to absurd extremes until they imploded into surreal mayhem. This anarchic approach to storytelling was part of the magic. Viewers stopped expecting tidy resolutions and instead enjoyed the wild ride. Each episode felt like a chaotic roller coaster where rules didn't exist. In a way, that was the point. How life in Thatcher's Britain felt absurd, so why should the stories make sense? Part of the fun of the show was spotting future comedy legends popping up in random roles. Jennifer Saunders, Hugh Laurie, Stephen Fry, Robbie Coltrane, and Emma Thompson all made appearances. At the time, they were rising stars in the alternative comedy scene, and the show gave them space to experiment. Each guest role added another layer of absurdity, whether it was a pompous policeman, a surreal teacher, or a bizarre bystander. These cameos gave fans Easter eggs to enjoy while showing off the depth of Britain's comedy talent pool. Looking back now, it feels like watching a Hall of Fame in the making. The show didn't just break rules, it helped in launching careers. Music was baked into the DNA of the Young Ones. Neil sang gloomy folk songs, bands performed live, and entire scenes broke into musical numbers without warning. Sometimes the songs advanced the story. Other times they existed purely to amplify the madness. The music choices reflected the cultural clash of the time: punk, rock, and alternative sounds crashing into the world of traditional television. This created a variety show feel within a sitcom shell. It shouldn't have worked, but it did. And that's just a fraction of how unpredictable the show was. The musical mayhem wasn't just filler, but it captured the spirit of rebellion. The genius of the show lay in throwing 4 wildly different characters into one house. Rik represented performative radicalism, Vivian pure destructive punk, Neil the burned out hippie, and Mike the smooth con man. Together, they mirrored the fractured youth culture of the 1980s. Instead of harmony, the clash of archetypes created constant conflict that drove the comedy. Audiences recognised these exaggerated personalities from their own lives, whether it was the loud activist, the violent punk, or the endlessly miserable hippie. By forcing them into one chaotic household, the show created a microcosm of British youth full of contradictions and tensions. That cultural clash was the beating heart of the young ones and why it remains so relatable today. Destruction wasn't just a gag in the young ones, it was practically an art form. Each episode featured collapsing sets, smashed objects, and violent outbursts that escalated until nothing was left standing. What made it funny was the sheer commitment. The actors threw themselves into the destruction with reckless abandon. Tables weren't gently tipped, but obliterated. Walls didn't crack, they exploded. The exaggerated violence gave the show a kinetic energy that felt closer to a cartoon than live action. It also symbolised the tearing down of old systems, both in comedy and in society. For a generation angry at authority and hungry for change, watching destruction become comedy was cathartic. It wasn't chaos for chaos's sake. Despite being deeply rooted in British culture, the young ones found an unlikely home across the Atlantic. MTV picked up the show in the mid-80s, broadcasting it to American audiences who had never seen anything like it. The surreal humour, punk aesthetic, and sheer unpredictability fascinated young viewers. It also influenced a wave of American alternative comedy, paving the way for shows that blended chaos and satire. For many US fans, this show was their first exposure to British humour outside of Monty Python, and it quickly gained cult status. The fact that such a uniquely British show resonated globally proved its impact. Comedy may be cultural, but rebellion speaks every language. In total, the show only produced 12 episodes across 2 seasons. That's shockingly little for a show that left such a deep mark, isn't it? Yet those 12 episodes were so packed with energy, ideas, and chaos that they felt like 100. The brevity became part of the legacy. It never had a chance to grow stale or safe. Instead, it burned brightly and vanished, leaving fans craving more. Its short run also cemented its cult status. With only a handful of episodes, fans could memorise every moment, quote every line, and re-watch endlessly without losing the magic. Longevity didn't matter, impact did. And in that regard, the young ones achieved more in 12 episodes than most shows do in decades. Decades later, this great show remains a cultural landmark. Its influence can be seen in countless comedy shows that embrace surrealism, political satire, and chaotic energy. From Bottom and the Mighty Boosh to American cult hits, its DNA is everywhere. More than just a sitcom, it was a movement. It gave voice to youth frustration, turned rebellion into laughter, and proved that comedy could be loud, messy, and meaningful all at once. Fans still quote lines, share clips, and introduce new generations to its madness. The show may have ended, but its spirit never did. It lives on as proof that sometimes the wildest ideas create the most unforgettable television. The Young Ones wasn't just a sitcom, it was a cultural explosion that rewrote the rules of comedy and captured the restless energy of an era. If you enjoyed this wild trip back to 80s Britain, smash that like button, share with fellow fans, and subscribe for more dives into TV history.